We've got two talks. The first talk has a time slot of 40 minutes and the second of 20 minutes. And I should say who I am. My name is Anne-Marie Christopherson, and I'm a hazard and risk scientist at GNS Science in New Zealand. The first speaker of this session is Dr. Bruce Marco, who's a research wildlife biologist with the US Forest Service of the United States Department of Agriculture. Bruce is joining us from Portland, Oregon. He has been a regular ABNMS meeting attendee since 2014, when the ABNMS meeting was first held in New Zealand in Rotorua. And he's been on the board for the past 3 years. Bruce is also an honorary lifetime member of the society. Today, Bruce will give us a journey into the history of the Bayesian networks that he's been involved with the title "To All the Bayesian Networks I've Loved Before." Bruce is hoping for some feedback and discussion at the end, so he'll kind of doesn't plan to use the whole time slot. So please keep on notes and post into the chat. And so to kind of then hopefully bring them up at the end of that. Thank you very much and welcome, Bruce.
Anne-Marie, thank you very much. Please interrupt if my audio or video fails here, but hopefully things will be smooth. Welcome everyone. Hi everybody from the United States. I want to start off by heralding the source of this wonderful title, give all due credit to my friend and colleague, Dr. Trent Penman, who provided this title for me. And he asked me kind of to give an overview of my life's track on how I've come to do Bayesian networks. So this is going to be kind of a helicopter quick overview, bit of a whirlwind, kind of a story of personal discovery. As I go through this, I really want everyone to be thinking about where are you now in your understanding and your expertise? Where do you want to go? What sort of major steps have influenced you in your field? So I view my development and interest in Bayesian network modeling as a very, very organic process, a very organic process that has that has multiple arms of influence that have really come to influence me in terms of learning about and understanding the concept of Bayesian interpretations and, of course, the framework itself. And I want to talk about not just how I've come to do Bayesian network modeling, but also the advances, the steps, these evolutionary arms. The first evolutionary arm that really influenced me was just basic Bayesian statistics. What I learned back in 1960s and 70s in college, in high school and college, actually. And this really was prompted by looking at not just Bayesian models, but pattern recognition. And for my interest and background, it goes back to the 1970s when I started to use a series of models developed by the US Fish and Wildlife Service called PATREC models, pattern recognition tools. And since I'm a wildlife ecologist, I picked up on those sorts of tools, which are basically Bayesian models to assess the posterior probabilities of the quality of habitat for some rare, threatened, or at-risk species, such as back then bald eagles. So way back in the 70s, that really got me interested when it was my first dip into the Bayesian pool with Bayes' theorem. After that, I started to explore, well, what is Bayesian inference? What is it really? What is Bayesianism? Perhaps you've heard that term too. And what's the philosophy of science coming from kind of a Bayes approach? Originally, originalists saw Bayes' theorem as an inductive process where you induce higher level hypotheses, theories, theorems, or even axioms from observations. But the true Bayesian philosophy, Bayesianism, turns that on its head and says, no, it should be a hypothetico-deductive process. That means that you first pose a hypothesis, and from that you deduce observations that could be made, and then you see if you're right or wrong. And if you're right or wrong, then you go back and you change your initial thinking, your prior probabilities. So that whole process really opened up the door for me from this first evolutionary lobe of Bayesian statistics, of pattern recognition. The second lobe came from my exploration of network theory. Okay, and I'm going through these not necessarily as a temporal sequence, but a series of explorations that really led to advances in Bayesian network modeling for me. Network theory. At the time in the 1970s, early 70s, I was doing an ecological study of the ecology of the wildlife use of pond and lake environments, pond and lake habitats in a very remote corner of Northwestern California. And there are some there, believe me. And I started to build food webs, trophic system food webs as to what species eat what and how much and how often. And from that, I built a series of qualitative network models and started to ask questions like, what are the controlling nodes in this network? Which species really are the key factors which controls the trophic energy flow through the system? Because that had a very, very important sort of management implications. If you want a fully functional ecological system, you have to be sure that the species are the key ones that control that information flow, in a sense, and that the habitat for them is provided. So that got me into considering, well, networks, so graph theory. So in the late 1980s and early 1990s, I developed a series of measures using graph theory, analyzing the connectivity of habitat patches. So representing maps, aerial photos, and then configurations of habitat areas and patches as networks, as graphs. Again, asking key things such what are the controlling factors, controlling features such as riparian areas and riverines that control the flow across the landscape. So I developed a series of these sorts of studies and looked at how landscapes might evolve themselves through time, and the graphs therefore would change, the controlling factors might change. And all this led to analyzing ways to assess for different species and different habitats, how you can identify the most important parts of the landscape. Again, feeding back to forest managers. Well, so this led me on a path to really explore complex networks, graph theory, and from that to look at this as a second sort of lobe of my exploration and evolution of Bayesian network modeling. The third lobe dealt with, well, let's get scientific, because everything to that point was sort of quasi-quantitative, a lot of sort of qualitative depictions. And so from the scientific rigor standpoint, that's where I started to work with experts and building expert systems back in the 1980s. I was coding in programming languages such as Lisp, ALISP, Snowball, Fastball. If you've never heard of them, they are semantic structure programming systems. And I was programming in a shell called EXSYS for expert systems. This was back in the mid 80s. One of the projects I was on, I was doing a side contracting work with a biomedical and technological corporation called Perkin-Elmer Corporation. One of the arms of that corporation actually helped build the Hubble Space Telescope. But I was with the biomedical arm, and I was asked to come in and consider how can you look at breath gas information real time in an operating room. Stephen alluded to some of this actually in his talk. It's called the capnogram. And by analyzing the waveform, the slopes of the wave, and so on, you can deduce, again, this hypothetical deductive scheme, what the influence could be on the patient, what sort of condition the patient could be experiencing. So back in the mid 1980s, I started to work with several doctors, MDs, and developed a series of decision trees that would help to evaluate capnogram waveforms and deduce what the situation could be for a patient real time in the operating um, uh, context. So I coded that as a series of so-called control rules in the expert system, which are simple if then or if then else sorts of rules. And it became the first real-time expert system analyzing capnogram information inside the operating room. And it gave the MD, the surgeon, on-site real-time information as to the various sorts of probabilities of different possible conditions of the patient. So since I was working with several MDs, we had different decision trees. So I started to ask, which expert should we use? How do we meld experts? Not just that, but who or what is an expert? What sort of makes someone an expert, and what is the nature of expertise? At an earlier conference here, I had given a talk on this whole scheme and topic, but still it was a very, very important part of the evolution of my thinking of considering how to represent expertise inside of a Bayes net, inside of some sort of a expert structure. So, and I won't go through every step here, but simply to point out that for many, many projects following that, back in the US Forest Service, dealing with wildlife conservation, I held a whole series of expert panels on a lot of different topics, feeding back to management what they would be able to use for outcome to help them do appropriate sort of conservation planning. One such project was to help US Fish and Wildlife Service decide whether to reintroduce a highly endangered species of native fish called the bull trout into one of the river systems here in Oregon. So what I did was to hold a series of expert panels on that, and we built some Bayes nets that helped us analyze what the influence of the predators could be, including bull and trout on some of the native existing species of fish. And the upshot is that it helped US Fish and Wildlife Service determine when and how to reintroduce the species. They decided to do it. So to this day, we have successfully reintroduced this endangered fish. Well, I recently wrote a book chapter on causal modeling and the role of expert knowledge, in which I explored some possible failing points of doing expert elicitation and expert paneling. Again, Stephen, I think, alluded to some of this too. There are a series of possible sources and types of biases that come in from individual experts, from the group, from the expert panel itself, even from the facilitator can have some sorts of biases. So it's very, very important to understand those and to hold the panel such that those are avoided. So from the scientific standpoint of scientific rigor, I wanted to ensure that knowledge was brought in. It's not just a belief system, but was rigorous, repeatable, documented, and that there were strict processes for expert elicitation and paneling. Okay, for the fourth lobe, can you guess what this might be? And if you're uncertain, you're right on, it's uncertainty itself. And this whole realm of what is uncertainty and how do you deal with it started to come to light when I was working with a lot of managers out on the ground for forest management and wildlife management. Because the important part is that managers started to consider uncertainty as evidence of lack of effect or lack of impact. Uncertainty as evidence of lack of impact, and that's not necessarily true with a lot of the work that we have done. So I wanted to bring to them a very, very simple kind of confusion table that if they were to call a species, say, threatened, and it truly is threatened, correct, that's good. If they say it's not threatened and it's really not, that's also correct, that's good. But of course, if they say something is threatened, but it's really not, then there's a type 1 sort of error. It's a false positive, and that's overprotection of the species, which means that the cost there could be a high opportunity cost of other sorts of forest resources foregone to conserve a forest stand instead of having it be for timber, say. On the other hand, if you say that a species is not threatened, but it really is, it's a type 2, it's a false negative, and that's under protection, a very different kind of implication for cost. The cost could be the local extirpation or extinction of the species. It could also be loss of credibility of the scientist, of the manager, and of the agency too. So very, very different sorts of type 1 and type 2 cost implications. So eventually I sort of structured this a little bit better. And I'm sure you've seen all this about the confusion table with false positives, true positives, and so on, sensitivity. Again, Stephen talked about some of this. Some of the terminology here can get rather convoluted a bit and a bit confused itself inside the confusion table, but there it is. All right, so I used this information in a study with Dr. Stephen Pawson and Owen Woodbury on predicting forest insect flight activity. When would possibly harmful forest insect pests start to fly and disperse and create damage throughout a forest? So we looked at a series of species and used actual field information to induce Bayesian nets to analyze and to estimate the probability of flight. And in this effort, again, looking at the rigor and trying to really display uncertainty very, very clearly to managers, we created a standard receiver operating characteristic rock curve, but we turned it on its head by focusing on type 2 error. Rock curves are typically shown as type 1 errors, false positives, but the false negative part, if you say that a possibly invasive, harmful forest insect pest isn't there when it really is, that could have dire economic outcomes. It could also have dire outcomes for international trade if you try to sell timber that is tainted by from forest insect pests. So not to go into detail here, but we really pushed the envelope in this study to depict a series of standard deviations and thresholds of what the manager might consider to be acceptable levels of false positives and false negatives, where they could pick the threshold and it would tell them what the final errors are. I also use this approach on uncertainty by mapping benthic macrofauna, basically invertebrates that live at the bottom of the ocean. And because industries were interested in citing wave energy and tidal energy off the shore of North America. And so they wanted to know, where should we not put such sites to avoid influencing rare, threatened, endangered benthic macrofauna. So here's one such species. It's a clam. It's a bivalve, and it's quite scarce, and it's scattered along the coast, just off the coast of North America, and used sample grab data to induce Bayesian nets. But the point is, the way we expressed it and showed it to the managers, we gave them the expected value of suitability of habitat, and also the level of uncertainty, which in this case is a Gaussian error rate. And also we gave them what was a database, what was the level of sample size, what's the empirical basis for all this information. So we're able to take this information and to map it out. So you're looking at western coast of Washington and Oregon, and we're able to map out exactly for each species what's the level of suitability of habitat, but also what's the uncertainty level and what's the experience, what's the database, what's the empirical foundation of the outcome here. So the manager can come in and see, well, this area looks like it's highly suitable, but it's also highly uncertain, and there's very scant information. So we should go back in and sample some more, or make some sort of choice there. So it was a way to visually, through GIS, show them information about uncertainty. And then I got into this whole concept of the psychology of uncertainty, dealing with managers. managers who would want to view uncertainty as the wrong kind of evidence. So I've always touted that uncertainty is information too, if interpreted and offered in the correct way. That the manager should know what is possible and what is uncertain and convey that to the public as well, if you're dealing with federal public forests and other sorts of resources. So that got me to thinking about the Johari window that we all know, perhaps by that's not by that certain name. And the key, most important pane of the window are the unknown unknowns. What you don't know, what others don't know. You don't know what you don't know. And that could be a very important trap in thinking or assuming that the lack of knowledge means that there is evidence for a lack of impact. So that's sort of a lesson that I help to offer to a lot of managers. And in a brief moment of shameless self-aggrandizement, I just want to show you that I have recently published a book on the science and management of uncertainty, dealing with doubt and natural resource management through CRC Press. I cover a lot of these sorts of topics there. Okay, enough of that. So uncertainty, I deal with statistics theory and the psychology of uncertainty. Another lobe deals with testing. Going back to the forest insect flight activity BaseNet model, we built a series of models and looked at a sensitivity analysis, how much each of the factors could influence the outcome, but also estimates and measures of model accuracy, calibration error rate, and validation accuracy too for each of the models. And they didn't always correlate perfectly with each other. So there was very sort of complementary information in terms of the performance, the uncertainty of the systems. And speaking of validation, with our own Dr. Anka Hania, we are co-first authors on this paper on what is the optimal value of K. This came out recently in K-fold cross validation. She provided a series of test Bayesian nets that we analyzed through simulated data sets to ask what's the optimal value of K when you splice and split data sets to do cross validation. So spoiler alert, it turns out to be like K equals 10, sometimes K equals 5. It's a function of what the correlations of the variables inside the model and the structure of the model. But folks have been casually implying that K equals 10 is best. And we found that, yeah, that's pretty much that's the case. So thanks, Anka, for your help on that. So in a separate study, in which I led on habitat of the endangered salt marsh harvest mouse in San Francisco, we looked at some concepts of uncertainty here too. And there's one thing that is certain, and that is that this is probably the cutest rodent in the world. And here it is poking through some Saliconia vegetation in a salt marsh. And they occur in a series of different habitats. So I took a suite of fields results of trapping the species and analyzing the habitat. And as with the earlier studies, we looked at model performance. Here I looked at model complexity as the number of nodes in each of the models, the number of links, and the number of conditional probabilities, matching it against model accuracy, that is the performance of the calibration. Overall confusion error rate, type 1 and type 2 error, and spherical payoff. So the optimal model was that it was least complex and that the highest accuracy. And that led me to write a paper on summarizing and reviewing a series of metrics for evaluating performance and uncertainty of Bayesian network models. And just one of the things that I had in there was to look at the correlation among some of the metrics of accuracy. And I found that the metrics, some were correlated highly, others not so, but the correlation itself would vary according to the type of model, the structure of the model too. So there was no one answer. So to me, it says that any and all of these sort of metrics and others are complementary to each other. All right, so that's testing, where we looked at calibration, and I looked at validation. And again, another sort of evolutionary step in my analyzing and advancing my understanding of Bayesian network modeling. A penultimate lobe dealt with machine learning. And as you probably know, you can use algorithms to induce the network structure of the model, to estimate the value of the probability parameters, and even to perhaps start to test and adjust the model over time. So for instance, in Netica, you can induce a structure of the network by using the TAN algorithm. Stands for Tree Augmented Network. And I used that in a study of 2 rare stork species in lowland Nepal. I've spent some time there, and taking the field data induced the TAN structure, which is essentially a structure of naive Bayes. Now, when I send this kind of structure to an editor in a journal, I almost always get an answer back saying that you have the model wrong, it's upside down, you have the arrows pointing the wrong way. No, the naive Bayes structure tells you the degree to which the response variable, which is the yellow box at the top, is explainable by the covariates, all the blue boxes. So the arrows point the correct way in this kind of a structure. And this is for Asian open bill stork. In the upper right, you can see why it's called open bill. When the bill is closed, it's still open. Interesting species. I also used it in an estimate of tidal marsh bird densities along the east coast of the US. And sometimes the naive Bayes structure gets very complicated with lots of covariates and sort of ends up looking like a Ferris wheel here. And using various algorithms to assess the value of the structure of the values of the probabilities. There are some algorithms such as EM, expectation maximization, which is a convergent log likelihood function similar to gradient. And if you have an information-based case file, you can implement either the EM or the gradient in this certain case, and have it estimate on the right side the actual values of the probabilities for the conditional probability table. And just to point out that sometimes your information-based, your case file, might not have all the combinations of all the inputs. In that case, what at least happens in Netica is that it will give you uniform probability distributions, which means that the model still runs. And you can go in and do interpolation if you want and adjust them by hand, but at least it's able to work with some of the missing data. And that's a very positive thing about Bayes nets that you don't get in a lot of the multivariate sort of frequentist schemes. And in terms of using machine learning for testing and adjusting, I'm starting to experiment with generative adversarial networks, or GANs, which is an approach used more in the field of neural network tools. And what that does is create a series of faux databases, which then test the model against itself. And in that sense, it iteratively improves the values of the model and the accuracy. So I'm starting to test this now, and I think I should have something to present somewhat soon. I think it's a whole new area of application of various tools for Bayes nets. So for my interest in machine learning came from the use of empirical data, network structures, and probability parameterization, and now some new stuff. And the final node, it deals with integration. And briefly here, Dr. Trent Penman, who gave us the title for this talk, and I penned this summary, this review of advances in Bayesian network modeling, integration of modeling technologies. And I won't go through this, but we have a whole series of other realms that have been tied into and that integrate with Bayesian nets. And this is an exciting area. Bayes nets really is a tool that can be sort of implanted in many other structural areas. For instance, the geographic information system, be able to map probabilities in uncertainties, the application of time expansion for dynamic Bayesian systems, such as predator-prey interactions, decision nodes, and Bayesian decision networks that can include costs and benefits explicitly, and so on. So integration. So those are my 7 realms of evolutionary advances. But there's an 8th one, the most important one of all, and that's implementation. And I have alluded to that. And I won't go into this much at all, but simply to show that I have used a lot of these tools that I've come up with for implementing descriptive ecological studies, predictive studies, and decision advisory tools in a suite of different environments and topics. And just one quickly deals with Pacific walruses and the influence of climate change up on the Arctic. And for that, I did what I call influence runs. This is different than sensitivity analysis. It's taking each of the inputs like ship and air, adverse influence, harvest levels, loss of sea ice through climate change, and analyze what's the best and the worst that could be done if you were to tilt each of these inputs to their highest and their lowest input schemes. So on the x-axis is time, on the y-axis is the probability of adverse income for the population of walruses, and found that for each, if you tilt them to the best and worst influence, you can show what the probability outcome could be. And it turns out that harvest levels might have the worst outcome if you have the highest harvest, but you don't get the best outcome except through amelioration of Arctic sea ice levels through climate change control. So we fed this information back to a lot of the managers at the highest level, and it's information that can serve to support climate change and global warming sorts of constructs inside the government now. And rare species conservation. I used a series of standards and guidelines that I codified for determining what level of surveys should be done, what's the conservation category that each of 1,000 species in old growth forests throughout the western parts of the US. What is the conservation category for that? And it was a massive set of very complicated, sometimes conflicting standards and guidelines that I was able to codify in a series of simple Bayes nets, and gave that to the managers and the biologists. And they were able to ascertain what the probability is for different species conservation categories for management, given knowledge about things like species rarity. Do you have data? Are they late successional old growth forests associated, and so on. And some of these nodes inside the published regulations are extremely complicated. So I converted them into Bayes nets, almost yes/no sorts of inputs throughout the edges there that give you the answers that feed into the overall estimator. We published this in 2006, and it served as the basis for determining conservation status and management for probably 1,000 species associated with old growth forests under the Northwest Forest Plan throughout western part of the US. So that was a major success. So that's my story. I have 8 different arms and lobes of this very organic process that I've gone through to understand and to build functional, useful sorts of Bayesian networks. So at this point, I hope this has really sparked your thinking. What have I missed? What have you gone through? Which of these sorts of lobes are most important to some of your work? So I would very much like to hear from you, either through chat, and I will say thank you very much, and I'll turn it right now back to Anne-Marie. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Bruce, for sharing your journey. We have a couple of questions coming in on the chat. Excuse me, and I'm just wondering, yeah, we have clapping as well. Do we have anyone who wants to put their hand up as well, or thinking about it while I ask? I just lost the chat. While I ask the questions that have already come through. No, I'm confused that this beautiful chat window up. It's gone. Come back. Thank you. So one of them is coming from B. What's the best advice you have for someone starting out on their journey into understanding and creating base nets?
Start simple. Start simple. Just some of the more complicated sorts of tools I've done work best when I was able to simplify them. Consider what are the main factors, but first consider what's the objective for what you're after. A Bayesian net can't do everything. It can serve to diagnose, it can predict, it can serve as a tool to get your arms around, which I think you know, and quite a few other things. So be really clear right up front as to what's the objective. And if you don't do that, then the model becomes something you want it to do more and more, and you end up with objective creep, as I call it. So start simple. Think about if it's a causal model and you want something to represent causality. What are the simplest measures of the most proximate sort of causes? And build just a boxes and arrow figure first. Don't start worrying about the probabilities and Bayes' theorem. Just build an influence figure first of just boxes and arrows. Run that by some colleagues. That's sort of informal sort of peer review. So that's where I would start then.
Mm-hmm. And you touched on a question that Helen has asked: under what circumstances should we not use a Bayesian network? That has helped you come across problems where other methods were more suitable.
Oh, outstanding question. Yeah, I mean, we have to be careful that, you know, if you have a hammer, everything's a nail and all that. You have to be very, very careful. I do have some colleagues who specialize in certain models throughout their career, and they kind of see everything in terms of those models. Sorts of topics and projects where it really does not fit. First of all, I think some of the managers that I've dealt with have a hard time thinking in terms of uncertainty and thinking in terms of proximate and ultimate causality. What are the things that can really influence now versus the things that influence those things for sort of long-term planning? So for those kinds of tools, I think a Bayes net, even though to some of us seems very sort of graphic and obvious, it can be fairly complicated. And I would back off and do something a lot simpler. Sometimes a simple sort of decision tree is easier to understand too. Helen, I think you asked that, right? If you have anything to offer, do you think you have areas where you see other sort of tools that could be helpful?
I think you I just really wanted to clarification, because you covered a lot of what I would have thought in terms of if we can have a simpler method, like some of my work, you know, if people like this regression model, sometimes that's a good way to go. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I was just wondering, yeah, sort of under what circumstances, like we might even go to something like systems dynamics, or maybe like a hybrid model. Like, you know, I struggle with like the one I'm working on now, struggling, you know, the chicken and egg, the feedback loops, and trying to convince experts, no, you can't have both. Pick the most, you know, pick your favorite relationship and do that. So yeah, I was just interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, the whole thing about feedback loops, that's something that Bayes nets really don't do very well. You can do time replication, like I showed with the predator-prey lynx hair one that I showed, but typically that's real hard to do. For that, I would use Stella or something else that's an actual time dynamic quantitative system that can have feedbacks. Has anyone else sort of run into that at all?
We probably have to wrap up to come to the second talk in the session. Okay. But there's another question out there, and Anke, if you see that Penny asked the question, maybe in the back in the split out rooms, you can put the people who still have a question together with Bruce, if that's not mucking up your plan. I'm not quite sure how you had planned to split us up.
No, so the plan is that in the breakout rooms, we'll have in the break a number of breakout rooms. Some of them will have the name of the sessions, and Bruce will go to the one that he, corresponding to his session. So people who have questions for Bruce can just self-select and join that room and ask the questions there.
That sounds fabulous. Thank you very much. So yeah, it's weird not saying, please join me thanking Bruce and clap. It's just a bit different on the Zoom. Yeah, the people with the pictures. Awesome. Thank you very much. So we're moving to the second speaker, who is Dr. Kate Parkins, who is a fire risk analyst at the University of Melbourne, where she holds a postdoctoral fellowship with the School of Ecosystem and Forest Sciences. Kate has been on the ABNMS board, I believe, for 1 year, and has also helped organizing this year's conference. Kate will talk to us about the long and winding road to better management of roadside vegetation. Welcome very much, Kate.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. So first of all, I'd like to begin this talk by acknowledging and paying my respects to the traditional owners, the Wadawurrung people, whose country this work was undertaken on. And I'd like to extend my respect to their elders, both past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge my fellow co-authors of this work, Brett Zaroulis, Trent Penman, and B. Pickering from the University of Melbourne. And we've had amazing support from some people from the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, Tim Gazzard, Chris Medlin, Julian Madigan, and Catherine McLeod. Roads. So we use them all the time, but the chances are you probably haven't paid too much attention to the vegetation that runs along roadsides. If you have noticed it, it's probably because it's particularly beautiful. Maybe there's lots of large hollow-bearing trees or beautiful flowers, or you've noticed it because it's in the way. Maybe a branch has fallen down across the road, a limb's come down in a storm, and perhaps you have to drive around it. Well, these humble patches of roadside vegetation that generally go unnoticed are actually really important parts of the landscape, especially on days where we have high fire danger. Roadside vegetation is predominantly managed from a road safety perspective, where vegetation is modified or removed such that it doesn't impede our visibility or our ability to drive safely along the road. However, roadside vegetation can also play an important role in fire behaviour. We see a huge number of ignitions starting along roadsides, whether deliberate or not, and it also contributes quite strongly to fire spread and fire behaviour. They're also really important parts of the landscape for safe access and egress, particularly when there is fire in the landscape. But roadsides are managed for a variety of different risks and different values, and this poses complex and challenging tasks for land and fire managers. For example, many roadside vegetation patches also have high environmental significance. They might often be the only remnant vegetation in an otherwise cleared landscape. However, managing for road safety or for fire prevention might also compete with our management, what might be the best management for biodiversity. And this is further complicated by all the varying agencies that are responsible for road management. So depending on the size of the road, the road might be managed by local councils, private landowners, or further up into the state government. But on days of high fire danger, roads are some of the riskiest places to be. The primary risks that are associated with roadside vegetation on days of high fire danger is through strong winds and through people trying to escape the fire, often becoming trapped by fallen trees across roads or by the fire front itself. However, roads are also really important as fuel breaks, so they help allow safe access and egress during bushfires for authorities, emergency services, and also members of the community. So it's really important that we manage roadsides so that they don't impinge on any of these essential functions. So the aim of this project was to see if we could quantify the risks that are associated with roadside vegetation and fire, and determine a series of management scenarios which might help to reduce those risks. So the key questions we were interested in asking were, can we develop a methodology that helps us identify where the highest risk roads are? And if we can, what types of management might help to reduce this risk? So we of course did this through Bayesian network modelling. We used Netica. Now, for somebody who has merely dipped a very tentative toe in the BayesNet's pool, I was led to believe that this project would be a very simple, straightforward project. Nice and simple, a handful of nodes. Essentially, we just wanted to work out what is the likelihood of a road being blocked by a fallen tree or large branch. Simple. Well, this side of the screen is what I was led to believe the BayesNet would look like, and the other side of the screen is actually how the process went. Sometimes it was more like this. So the project was undertaken as a pilot study. The aim is eventually to roll this out across the state of Victoria, but for the start of the project, we just looked at the Barwon Southwest region. So this is mostly around the Corangamite Shire, down on Port Phillip Bay. So a lot of this area is cleared agricultural land, but there is quite a lot of high value roadside vegetation in this area. So what did we do? There are a lot of different components in this model, and I've tried to keep it as streamlined as possible, but look, this talk really does what it says on the tin. It has been a very long and very winding road, so stay with me. First of all, we determined that weather conditions would be really important to consider. We wanted to understand what types of weather conditions would be conducive to tree fall. So to populate the weather nodes, we collected and analysed around 15 years of emergency services data. So this was provided by the State Emergency Service, and we received over 180,000 records of days when the SES had been called out to remove a fallen tree or a large branch from roads. We then combined this data with local weather station data, and we were able to extract the conditions on the days where the SES was notified of a fallen tree. So using this data, we were able to extract variables like the temperature, wind speed, wind direction, relative humidity, and drought factor to determine what is the weather that contributes to trees falling. Given this was about quantifying fire risk, we also linked this to a series of fire nodes. So we linked it to our forest fire danger index, and also whether there was the presence of fire in the landscape or not, as we expect fire to increase the likelihood of things falling along roadsides. Next, we determined that there were probably particular characteristics of the roadside vegetation that would contribute to the likelihood of things falling. For example, the level of exposure. So the more exposed trees were, the higher they had a chance of falling. So things like blocks that were larger and oriented away from the prevailing wind were less likely to fall, whereas thin strips of vegetation perpendicular to the prevailing wind were more likely to fall. Now, these nodes were populated using expert elicitation workshops. We held a series of workshops with tree experts and got them to look at a whole series of images and use their own knowledge to determine the things that contribute to the level of exposure. Next, we considered the characteristics of individual trees that make them more likely to fall over. So some trees are just more likely to fall than others. We know that eucalypt species, for example, are more likely to drop limbs than other species. And we also think that certain ages of trees as well. So you can see in the top image, an old dead eucalypt is much more likely to impact the road than something like a broad cypress. Again, a lot of this information was populated through expert elicitation workshops. And we also undertook a desktop review using Google Street View to analyse over 2,000 roadside trees. And we were able to determine certain things like tree lean, age, species that would contribute to the susceptibility or vulnerability of these trees. We also integrated a series of different management options to see how management might influence susceptibility. So if we can understand why a tree falls, we also need to consider how much that is likely to impact the road. So if a tree falls in the middle of a field or at the back of a roadside verge that is nowhere near the road, then this isn't something that we're particularly interested in because it's not likely to impact on the road. So we also included a series of nodes that look at the height of a tree and the distance to road center. So this is looking at how much the tree is likely to impact on the road and whether somebody might be able to drive around it or not. Next, we looked at vehicle occupation rates and information about the vehicles, the speed, the travel time, the overall things that contribute to how many people are on the road. So we looked at the probability of impact, which relates to either a tree striking a vehicle or a vehicle striking a fallen tree or branch. Both of these types of impact are influenced by the speed that a vehicle is travelling. So the faster a vehicle travels, the less likely it is to be struck by a fallen tree, but the more likely it is to strike a fallen tree. And this is related to the stopping distance. A lot of these data we had from existing data from a study by Ellison in 2005, which puts a lot of values to things like travel speeds by roadside, road size, the different types of roads, stopping distance. And we also integrated some local traffic data from the region where we were studying. And finally, we included some nodes which captured the chance of a road being blocked, given all of these other variables. So this was a function of the number of trees or branches falling, how close the trees were to the road, as well as things like the prevailing weather conditions. So all of this comes together in this one small orange node down the bottom, which is our overall risk. And overall risk is essentially a combination of the probability of something falling, the probability that that tree will block the road having fallen, and the probability that a vehicle will encounter the blockage. So, as I said, quite complicated, quite long and winding. So what did we find out? Well, we used the sensitivity to findings function in Netica, and this function examines the extent to which changing one variable will affect the variable of interest. So our variable of interest was the overall risk node. And we found that increased risk is predominantly a function of whether the road is blocked or not. So if the road is blocked, then the risk is much higher, which makes sense. The other factors that contribute to higher risk were things like the number of trees down. However, road blocked was twice as important as the number of things that had fallen. So what this means is that something falling on a roadside will contribute to higher risk, regardless of how many things have fallen. We found that risk was also influenced by the amount of potential overlap and the distance to the road centre. So this is essentially whether the road is properly blocked or not. In terms of trees down, this node was strongly influenced by the presence of fire in the landscape, as well as the weather nodes. So the worse the weather is, the more likely trees are to fall, which also makes sense. And the presence of fire is also contributing to things falling. However, there is a very strong correlation here, as we know that the higher the fire danger rating, the worse the fire weather conditions tend to be. So what can we do with all of this information? Well, we really wanted to be able to identify where the highest risk roads were. So we went a step further and we spatialized some of the outputs from the BayesNets to help us predict where the highest risk areas are located in the region. So this image shows some of our preliminary outputs for a random location in our study area. And no, it's not your eyes. I've deliberately made this image blurry because the data is quite sensitive, as you can imagine. So basically what you need to get from this image is that these areas are showing us where the highest overall risk is. So the areas that are red obviously identify parts of the road network that are considered highest risk, and the green areas are where there is the lowest risk. So this is really, really important for helping us determine where we put management into the landscape. Management is obviously very expensive, so if we can prioritise these areas, that's much, much better for reducing risk and also for cost benefit type analyses. We also tested a series of different roadside management scenarios, from complete tree removal to some thinning, prescribed burning, slashing, and this helped us see if management was able to reduce this risk. So again, a blurry image. What this is showing is our residual risk. So assuming we've undertaken different types of management in the landscape, how much of the risk is remaining? So the areas that are red show that there's, regardless of management, we are not getting a meaningful reduction in risk, but the blue and green areas are areas where the integration of management into these areas has resulted in a meaningful reduction in risk. So how can we use management, and what types of management can we use to reduce the risk? Well, our results show that if we can reduce the potential overlap of roadside vegetation, so things like having bigger verges, grassy verges with trees further away from the road, this is likely to reduce risk, as well as considering things like the size, the shape, and the orientation of future plantings. So the effective management of fire risk in the landscape is increasingly important, especially as our climate changes and we see more frequent and more intense bushfires. During the Black Summer fire season this year in Australia, several lives were lost on roads as people tried to flee the fire front, or where emergency services were trying to access and suppress the fires. So effective risk reduction along roadsides is just one small piece of a big puzzle that helps us protect people and helps us reduce the risk of days of high fire danger. So hopefully this research will help contribute to making our roads safer, particularly on those days where we have really high fire danger. Thanks, that's me.
Thank you very much, Kate. Have we got any questions coming in? I haven't noticed anything on the chat, but if we don't, I definitely have some.
We just had one pop up from Helen Mayfield. She'd like to know how the inclusion of weather relates to the management actions.
Sorry, Kate, it's Helen. Does that question make sense, or would you like me to explain it a bit better?
Maybe explain it a bit better?
Yeah, I thought so.
Sorry.
So it's just, so you've got a lot of factors in there, like distance to road and the type of tree, and all of these are things that we can manage for, and that would vary from road to road or from tree to tree. So, but the inclusion of weather variables, like you had some climate variables in that, I was wondering, is that because you want to predict at different times, like for example in storm season we're a bit more concerned? Or I just wasn't sure how the weather, you've got some that are sort of spatial causal and some that are sort of more temporal things that would vary less from tree to tree. So I was just wondering about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the weather integration was a really interesting one, and we included it and got rid of it and included it and got rid of it. I think we ended up deciding that it was important to include for a few different reasons. We think that in terms of the presence of fire, that's quite strongly linked to the fire danger rating. And we do know that when the fire danger rating is higher, we usually see strong winds, we see wind changes, high temperatures, and these are all conducive to tree fall. But we also wanted to integrate things that are likely to drive tree fall a bit further as well in terms of individual weather conditions. So often if there's been really high temperatures followed by a period of rainfall, our experts thought that this contributes to limbs falling and trees falling. So we wanted to be able to try and integrate some of the specific conditions on a specific day that might contribute to susceptibility.
Okay, so it was about modelling when there would be risk as well as where there would be risk.
Yes,
Okay,
exactly.
cool, thank you.